Hello, I hope you're all enjoying our program. And now I'm here to introduce yet another great speaker. So, on behalf of the International Spiritist Medical Association, I'm honored to introduce Dr. Rupert Sheldrake, who is internationally recognized as a scientist, a writer, and lecturer. Dr. Rupert Sheldrake is a biologist. He has a PhD from the University of Cambridge, and he has authored 9 books, including The Science Delusion, Freeing the Spirit of Inquiry, which is known in the US as Science Set Free. He was a fellow of Clare College in Cambridge and a research fellow of the Royal Society. He's a fellow of the Institute of Noetic Science in California and of Shoemaker College in Devon, England. He's best known for his hypothesis of the morphic resonance. And actually, many of us Spiritist speakers have many times cited him when we talk about perispirit, when we make analogy between the morphic fields and perispirit. So he is well known among us Spiritists. If you want to know more about Dr. Sheldrake, you can go to his website, www.sheldrake.org. So today, Dr. Sheldrake will talk about science and spiritual practices. And with great pleasure, I give you the floor, Dr. Sheldrake. You're very welcome.
Science has traditionally been thought of as opposed to spirituality and religion. And indeed, for scientists who've turned science into a belief system, a kind of substitute religion, the religion of scientism, there is an implacable opposition to everything spiritual and religious. However, that ideology, that depressing materialist belief system, which still some scientists fervently believe in, many don't really believe in it very strongly. They pretend to when they're at work. But it's no longer something that all scientists believe, if it ever was. Those who have a more open view take the view that science can illuminate spiritual and religious practices. And in fact, in the last 20 or 30 years, there have now been many studies of science and scientific studies of the effect of religious and spiritual practices. There have been literally thousands of papers in peer-reviewed journals. In 2001, an enormous handbook summarizing thousands of papers was published called the Handbook of Religion and Health. And the second edition came out in 2012. Here it is, the Handbook of Religion and Health. You can see it's very thick. It weighs a lot and costs a lot. It's a kind of academic volume. And what it does is summarizes thousands more papers on the effects of religious and spiritual practices on health. And basically, the results of many studies in many countries, published in lots of respected journals, shows that spiritual and religious practices have beneficial effects on people's health. People who have these practices are happier, healthier, and live longer than those that don't. This must mean that the opposite is true. People who don't have spiritual and religious practices are unhappier, unhealthier, and live shorter than those that do. That's why I think militant atheism should come with a health warning. So there are many benefits, and of course there are many different spiritual practices. And since I'm both a scientist and a spiritual inquirer with a number of spiritual practices myself, um, in my two most recent books, I've brought these two sides of my own life together. And indeed, through these scientific studies, many scientists are now bringing these areas together. I've published two books on these subjects. The first one is called Science and Spiritual Practices. And this covers 7 different spiritual practices that have been investigated scientifically. And I discuss the practices, the scientific studies of them, and also suggest at the end of each chapter 2 simple ways in which people can try these practices for themselves. The sequel to that book, the second book, which has recently appeared in English, is called Ways to Go Beyond and Why They Work. And in it, I deal with 7 more spiritual practices. I don't attempt to cover every conceivable spiritual practice, but just a wide enough variety to show how many practices there are, and also what the scientific studies show. I don't have time to discuss all of them in this talk, but what I'll do is start by talking about gratitude. Gratitude is fundamental in all religions. All of them involve prayers, hymns, psalms, ways of giving thanks. All of them encourage us to be grateful. And in fact, of course, ordinary, normal, civilized human behavior encourages us to be grateful. Children are taught to say thank you when they're given something, because it's just polite to do that. You acknowledge something you're given. In the branch of psychology called positive psychology, which studies what makes people happy, unlike much of psychology which studies what makes people miserable, these studies on what make people happy have shown that happy people are usually grateful people. People who are grateful, who have a grateful attitude, are happier and also more popular. This is perhaps not very surprising. The opposite of being grateful is taking things for granted or feeling entitled. And people who are like that often complain a lot more. Not surprisingly, people who are ungrateful, who don't say thank you, who feel they're entitled to everything, and who complain a lot, are less popular and less happy than grateful people. Now, when these surveys showed that this was the case, happy people were grateful people, the critics of the research said, well, of course, these happy people are grateful. They're grateful because they're happy. But the researchers decided to find out whether they're grateful because they're happy or happy because they're grateful. So they did an experiment. Their simplest experiment involves dividing a group of people into 3 subgroups at random. One of those subgroups is asked to write a list of problems they've had in the previous week, things that have made them unhappy. And the second group is asked to write a story about something that happened in the previous week. And the third group writes a list of things that they're grateful for that have happened in the previous week. After several days, the people who wrote the gratitude list are measurably happier than those who thought about their problems or who just wrote a story. Gratitude makes people happier, measurably happier for days. Just a simple thing like making a list. The most successful exercise that these scientists devised in their experiments was what they called the gratitude letter. They asked subjects to write a letter to someone who had helped them in their lives, who they had never properly acknowledged. It could be a teacher, a family member, a friend. So they wrote them a letter thanking them for what they'd been given. And then they went to that person and read it to them. And people who did that were measurably happier for up to 2 months afterwards, had an enormous effect. being grateful. And this is something that we can put into practice in our everyday lives. I mean, many people already do this. I myself, I pray at nights, and before beginning of my prayers, I give thanks for all the good things that have happened in that day, and make a kind of list of things for which I'm grateful. And that's a very simple practice anyone can do. And if you don't do it already, I suggest trying it out. If you do it for a week, just a list every evening, you could write it down or just think it. I think you'll begin to notice a much stronger sense of connection, and you'll start feeling happier as a result. Another way of expressing gratitude is very traditional. In many traditional societies, people say a grace together before they eat. They give thanks to God or to whatever spirit or being they recognize as the power from which all things come. And in modern secular societies, many families have stopped doing that. They think it's old-fashioned, or some members of the family are atheists, or they have visitors who belong to another religion. They don't want to embarrass them. All sorts of reasons why people have stopped doing it. But I think this is a great loss. It costs nothing, and it makes a real difference. In our own family, we have a short pause before we eat. We hold hands. Now, when we have guests, we can't because of the COVID regulations, but we hold a space together, and we either say a grace or sing a grace, or just have a short period of silence, which is simplest, when everyone can give thanks in their own way and acknowledge all the many gifts we have. Of course, the kind of thanks you give depend on your belief system. If you're a materialist, you can still give thanks for the people who cook the food, the people who've grown the food, for the earth that gives rise to the food. But if your belief system goes beyond the narrow limits of materialism, if you acknowledge spiritual forces and powers, you can give thanks to them for all the blessings on your life, even for just being alive itself. And of course, there's no limit to how far you can go in your gratitude. So here's a spiritual practice all religions encourage. All of them have forms of gratitude in hymns and prayers and psalms and other expressions of gratitude, something we can employ in our own lives. And what it does is brings us more into the flow. Everything we receive is a flow to us from other people and from the universe and from the earth. And by giving thanks, we're giving something back. We're acknowledging that flow, and we're becoming part of it by passing on something. And of course, if we're really grateful, then we'll become more generous ourselves and contribute to that flow. When we recognize how much of what we have is a gift, then it will encourage us to become more generous and give ourselves. The second spiritual practice that I wanted to talk about is meditation. There's now been a lot of research on meditation, and it's practiced in many parts of the world in many different religions. The best known today are the Hindu and Buddhist forms of meditation. But of course, this is something that Christian monks and nuns have been doing for about 1,500 years or more. It's called contemplative prayer in the Christian tradition, but they spend many hours in exercises, usually of repetitive prayers, which are a bit like mantras, which have a meditative effect. There are two main kinds of meditation, ones that involve repetitive prayers or mantras, and mindfulness meditation that involves paying attention to the breathing and to sensations in the body. Both of them are ways of becoming present and detaching ourselves from an involvement in the constant stream of thoughts and chattering in our minds, our dialogue, internal dialogue full of things with worries, anxieties, resentments, fantasies, fears, all the things that our minds are filled with normally. The parts of the brain concerned with that internal dialogue are called the default mode network. And during meditation, brain scans show that there's a lessening of the activity of the default mode network as we come more into the present, as we, through concentrating on the mantra or the breathing, detach ourselves from that chain of thoughts. So meditation is something that brings people into the present, makes them feel calmer. It has measurable physiological effects. It reduces the blood pressure. People sleep better. People who meditate regularly are less depressed. And that's one reason why you can now get a prescription for meditation from a psychiatrist here in Britain on our National Health Service, because meditation has been found to counteract mild and moderate depression more effectively than antidepressant drugs, and of course with fewer side effects. And of course, it's also cheaper. A lot of people meditate because it makes them feel better, and it's often promoted as a secular means of improving mental and emotional health, a bit like a kind of mental gym. About 18 million Americans now meditate in the United States. This has become a huge popular movement. When I was a child, I never heard of meditation, and I didn't know anyone who did it. Now, almost everyone I know has tried it, at least, even if they haven't continued with it. It has measurable effects on physiology, well-being, even on brain anatomy. Brain scans of Tibetan monks who've meditated for years show anatomical changes that are an actual result of this meditation on the very structure of their brains. Now, meditation can be done by people who are materialists or atheists, and in fact, quite a lot of atheists have now recognized the value of spiritual practices, partly because of the research I referred to earlier. In fact, Sam Harris, who's one of the so-called new atheists in the United States, is now giving online meditation courses. Now, atheists are usually materialists, and they have a worldview that reality consists only of matter. That's why they're called materialists. And that matter is unconscious and purposeless. The entire universe is nothing but unconscious, purposeless matter. There's no God, there's no spirits, there's no angels, there's no spirits of the dead, there's no saints. All of these, at best, are nothing but imaginations in human minds, and therefore inside human brains. This is a very depressing worldview, of course, and it's not surprising that the most predominant mental illness in secular societies is depression. But when people meditate, they often have a feeling that their consciousness is part of something greater than themselves, a hint or sometimes a full-blown mystical experience. Mystical experiences are when we feel our own mind as part of a greater presence or consciousness, or part of a greater source of love or meaning. There are many ways of expressing this. These experiences come partly through spiritual practices. Sometimes they occur spontaneously. People sometimes have them just walking outdoors in nature when making love. Sometimes people have them as a result of near-death experiences. They have an accident or a heart attack. They nearly die. Typically, they feel themselves floating out of their body, then going through a kind of tunnel into a realm of light and love and joy. And they often meet loved ones there, sometimes deceased relatives, sometimes angels, sometimes Christ or luminous beings. But then, of course, they have to come back. They usually don't want to leave there, but it's only a near-death experience, so they have to come back. And when people have had these experiences, and now millions of people have, thanks to modern medicine, far more people nearly die and get resuscitated than used to. They used to just die. When people have had these experiences, they usually say it's reduced their fear of death. They've become much more spiritual. People around them say their behavior's improved. They're more considerate to other people. It's a transformative experience, even though the actual experience may objectively last only a few minutes. So, mystical experiences are quite common, and when people have them, they feel that they're part of something greater than themselves. Well, when materialists or atheists have these experiences when meditating or just spontaneously, they have to try and explain it by saying there is no such thing as consciousness out there. There's no God, there's no spirits, there's no angels. Everything's inside the brain. The mind is nothing but the activity of the brain. Therefore, all these experiences are inside the head. The meditation is affecting the brain and affecting neurotransmitters and electrical activity in the brain. And in fact, that's true. We know it does all those things. But then they say it's nothing but these things. Well, I suspect that if meditators go on meditating, they may change their worldview. Because basically, what they're being asked to do by the materialist worldview is to deny their most immediate experience of a connection with a greater consciousness in favor of a theory which is notoriously bad at explaining consciousness and, in fact, denies it, and then has to try and explain away the fact that humans are conscious. Our own consciousness is an embarrassment for materialism, which is why the existence of human consciousness is called the hard problem in the philosophy of mind, largely dominated by materialists. It's very hard for them to explain consciousness. They try to explain it away. When people started meditating in Christian monasteries, in Buddhist monasteries, in Hindu holy men in caves and holy women meditating under trees and in the wilderness and by caves and in monasteries, they weren't doing it so they could relax after a busy day's work or stop feeling frazzled by the pressures of modern life or so they could sleep better. They were doing it because they wanted to come into contact with that ground of consciousness itself, which we can experience in a mystical experience through meditation. And this became their motive. They were doing it because they felt it connected them to something much greater than themselves. And that's why I do it, and that's why many people do it. And I suspect that materialists and atheists who meditate, if they persist long enough, are likely to think, well, why not trust my own experience rather than just put all my faith in a theory which I accept on authority? And indeed, often people accept it on blind faith. The faith in science is exactly what a lot of atheists claim faith in religion is. They say it's blind faith based on authority, and people just believe what they're told to believe. Well, most people have never done any science, and most people who believe in science know virtually nothing about it. They have to take it all on faith from the high priests of the scientific world, and just believe what they tell them because they can't critically examine it. In my own experience, people who are religious believers today are very often much less dogmatic than believers in scientism, the religion of science. Well, meditation is one way of entering into a kind of state of spiritual connection, and that doesn't happen all the time. A lot of the meditation, there's still the chattering mind going on, and it may get less intrusive. We can become less attached to it, but it's certainly not bliss from beginning to end when meditating. But in my book, Ways to Go Beyond, I discuss some spiritual practices which most people don't think of as spiritual practices at all. For example, sports. Most people think of sports as a supremely secular activity. And yet, I think in the modern world, sports has become, for many people, the most important way of achieving altered states of consciousness. The whole point of many spiritual practices is to come into the present, so that you're completely present. You can only have a spiritual experience if you're in the present. spiritual experiences are of a spiritual presence, and you have to be in the present for that. So meditation and other spiritual practices are ways of doing that. But sports is also a way of doing it. If you're skiing downhill at 80 kilometers an hour, you have to pay complete attention, because if you get it wrong, you might go over a cliff and you'd be dead. If you're climbing a mountain and you're halfway up a rock face, you have to concentrate totally on where you put your fingers and your feet next. You can't be worrying about whether you paid the bills or some annoying remark somebody made to you that really annoyed you and upset you. You have to be present, completely present. And if you're in the middle of a football game and there's a crowd cheering and someone passes you the ball and you have to know whether you can get it in the goal, you can only do that by being completely present. So I think that sports, including team games and things that aren't team games like skiing and mountaineering, are all about the exercise of physical skill, bringing you into the present. In the Oriental martial arts and in Zen Buddhism, the importance of these physical skills as spiritual practices has long been recognized. The martial arts are not just about building up muscles and getting stronger. They're about learning about the flow of energy through one's own body and through that of one's opponents, and being completely present. A famous book called Zen and the Art of Archery was one of the first books to introduce to the West this Oriental way of thinking about sports as a spiritual practice. So I think that one of the ways that we can actually demystify the spiritual realm is to recognize that actually for many people, even people who say they have no religious beliefs at all, sports are fulfilling a major spiritual function. So now I'd like to say a little bit about singing and chanting. Singing and chanting are present in all religious traditions. There are wonderful chants in monasteries, Catholic and Orthodox monasteries. There are hymns, there are psalms, there's that wonderful gospel music of African American churches. There's chanting within Islam. Sufis have chanting in sacred song. Hindus have many chants and songs, and like bhajans. We find singing and chanting in all religious traditions, including shamanic societies, tribal societies. It's an integral part of their life. And I think this is so for several reasons. First of all, modern evolutionary theorists now believe that singing came first in human evolution before speaking, before language. People were singing together. And if people sing together, it brings the group together as one. We have to breathe together to sing together. We literally resonate together, and it creates a kind of group feeling of the whole group by doing this. And, in traditional societies, virtually everybody sings in groups. In modern secular societies, especially among atheists and others who've stopped going to church, or synagogue or mosque or wherever, who've left their traditional spiritual and religious practices, then, although they're surrounded by music on the radio and on computers and things, they don't sing. It's probably the first time in history when large numbers of people never sing. And there's now many studies that show that singing and chanting has enormously beneficial effects on people, both for their health, their relaxation, physiological effects, and bonding with other people. My wife, Jill Peirce, teaches singing and chanting to groups of people, and she's been doing it for more than 30 years. And I've seen over and over again how groups of people, some of whom think they can't sing at all, spend a weekend together chanting and singing, and most of them end up looking bright-eyed and bushy-tailed and, obviously happy. They're radiant. after doing this, and they feel much more bonded and connected. So this is another spiritual practice which can have powerful effects, and it's part of many rituals and many traditions, and both within and outside religions. Here in Britain, there's been a big movement for community choirs. A lot of people don't go to church. Religion is now a minority pursuit. Most people in the population say they have no religion, or it's a very secular society. But even so, many people join community choirs simply because they find this is so helpful and beneficial. One particular kind of chanting, mantras, and traditional prayers, have an additional power, which I think comes about through what I call morphic resonance. I think morphic resonance also plays a very important part in spiritual practices involving rituals. All religions, and indeed most secular societies, have rituals, and many rituals involve reenacting a foundation story of that social group. And by taking part in the ritual, individual people become part of that group, connected with other members of that group in the present, but also with all those who've done it in the past, right back to the first time it happened. One example of this kind of ritual is the Jewish feast of the Passover. Jewish people every year meet together with members of their family and other groups, and they reenact the Passover meal, the last meal that the Jewish people had in Egypt while they were slaves, before they were freed, and went on their epic 40-year journey through the wilderness to the Promised Land, a key turning point in Jewish history. So they reenact that Passover meal and tell the story of the first Passover. And by doing so, they become part of the Jewish community, and they link themselves, the present Jewish community links itself through the past right back to the first Passover meal, connecting all the intervening generations ever since then. The Christian Holy Communion is another ritual of this kind, originally a Passover meal itself. And Christians in Holy Communion all over the world regularly reenact this Last Supper of Jesus with his disciples in this ritual meal of bread and wine. Now, unfortunately, only bread, because the wine, which we have in the Anglican Church here in England, is now banned for COVID reasons. I hope it'll be back soon. Anyway, it's a ritual meal, it's sharing in a ritual. And the American Thanksgiving dinner in the United States, which is a reenactment of the original Thanksgiving dinner of the first settlers in North America from England. They gave thanks for surviving and being able to live in that new land. And every year, this Thanksgiving dinner is reenacted. It's probably the most important national ritual in the United States. Significantly, it's about giving thanks. So it ticks the box of gratitude as well. Well, what's going on in these rituals? I think that actually in these rituals, which are conservative in form, they reenact the same stories, they use the same words, chants, foods, smells, same kind of incense if they use incense. They're very conservative. Why do people do them? Why do they think they work? Well, I think that morphic resonance can help to provide a deeper understanding of rituals. And first, I'll probably have to say a few words about morphic resonance for those of you who are not familiar with the ideas. So I'll just summarize this briefly, and then I'll go back to rituals and some further implications of morphic resonance. Morphic resonance is the idea that there's a kind of memory in nature. The universe has a memory. It's not just governed by eternal laws. The standard assumption within science, the belief, one of the assumptions or dogmas of materialism, is that at the moment of the Big Bang, the beginning of the universe, all the laws of nature were fixed like a kind of cosmic Napoleonic code. There's no evidence that that was the case, because nobody was around, no scientist was around wearing their white coat with their measuring instruments at the moment of the Big Bang, when the universe was less than the size of the head of a pin and billions of degrees centigrade. Um, so this is simply an assumption, um, and it's taken for granted by most scientists. But morphic resonance leads to a quite different approach. It says the regularities of nature are more like habits than laws, and habits can evolve. And so there's an evolution of habits of nature as well as of nature itself, rather than thinking of the whole of nature evolving under the aspect of fixed laws. This theory of morphic resonance also says that each species has a kind of collective memory. The human collective memory was called by C.G. Jung, the psychologist, the collective unconscious. But I think all memories, or all species have a collective unconscious. The instincts of birds, of spiders, and of all sorts of animals are a kind of collective memory of the way their ancestors have behaved and responded to challenges. Um, we all draw upon a collective memory and in turn contribute to it. Morphic resonance works on the basis of similarity. The more similar a pattern of resonant activity is within a self-organizing system, like a plant, an animal, a molecule, a crystal, a galaxy, a solar system, a star, a planet, the more similar the pattern of activity in the self-organizing system is to a previous one, then the greater the resonance, the greater the memory, the stronger the memory. All members of a species are quite similar to each other. That's why we recognize them as members of a species. So they all contribute to the collective memory. Family members are more similar than anyone else, so they have a greater contribution. Ancestors and members of the family have a greater contribution to the collective memory of the family or of the individual within the family than others. And similarity is the key here, and I think that ordinary memory, what you and I remember, how we remember what we did yesterday or where we went on holiday, or how we remember the words of English or Portuguese or Spanish or French or whatever language we speak. All these kinds of memory and memories of skills like riding bicycles and writing, handwriting, all these kinds of memories, I think, are reinforced by collective memory, but I think our individual memories also depend on resonance. If you think, who is most similar to me in the past? The answer is me. I'm more similar to me, and you're more similar to you in the past than you are to anyone else. That means the most specific resonance acting on us from the past is from ourselves. And I think that's how normal memory works. I think our brains are more like TV receivers tuning in to our memories than like video recorders storing them as physical traces. The official materialist theory is that memories are stored as material traces in brains. But that theory has not turned out to be very successful. Attempts to find memory traces have failed over and over again, as I show in the discussion in my book, The Science Delusion. The Science Delusion, which is called in America, United States, is called Science Set Free. And it has different titles in Portuguese, French, and Spanish. Memories are probably not stored inside brains, and therefore the standard materialist argument about survival of bodily death may not be valid. Materialists like to argue, eliminated at death. If all memories are eliminated at death by the brain and decay of the brain, then survival of bodily death is impossible. It's impossible for people to survive and have a life after this life, as spirits or as souls or in whatever form you conceive them. It's impossible for ancestors to influence us today. It's impossible for spirit mediums to contact ancestors. And so therefore this belief, or rather an assumption, that memories are in the brain is a key part of the atheist and materialist belief system. It's not supported by good evidence at all. Morphic resonance explains it better. I think that this also gives a new light on survival. If memories are stored in the brain, they're eliminated at death. If they're not stored in the brain, they could survive because they're not inside the brain. There still has to be something to tune into them. That's another question. But it's interesting that brain damage can lead to loss of memory, but that doesn't necessarily mean the memories are stored there. It may simply mean the damaged brains are unable to retrieve the memories. Like if I damaged your TV set and you couldn't receive one of your familiar TV channels, that wouldn't prove that all the people and music you see on that channel are stored inside the bit of the set I've damaged. It would merely show that bit is concerned with receiving or tuning into the transmissions. So I think that the evidence for survival of bodily death is an open question scientifically. It's not closed down by the assumption that memories are in the brain, because this is only an assumption. Now, coming back to spiritual practices of rituals, what happens in rituals is that people reenact the ritual as similarly as possible, the way it's been done before, the same kind of chanting, the same kind of music, the same kind of gestures, and so on. And what I think rituals are doing is deliberately doing things as similarly as possible, because this sets up morphic resonance. If you take part in a Holy Communion service or a traditional wedding service or any other kind of ritual, you're coming into resonance with those who've taken part in similar rituals in the past. You're resonating across time. There's a presence of the past. The ancestors and the predecessors become present through this ritual, and you, in turn, will become present to people doing it after you, long after you're dead. You will contribute to this group of people who make up the field, the morphic field of this ritual that goes through morphic resonance and affects those who are participating in it now. So I think that morphic resonance can help to illuminate rituals, and rituals are, after all, about connection. Spiritual practices are about connection, connecting us with each other and with greater forms of consciousness. And in a ritual, you're invoking gods or spirits. You're carrying out a ritual that's been done many times before. You're linking to those who've done it before. You're connecting with ancestors and predecessors. In the Christian tradition, it's called the communion of saints. You become part of what the English prayer book calls the blessed company of all faithful people. You're linked to all those who've gone before. You're connected. So that's another kind of spiritual practice. Now, I think that ancestors and those who've gone before us play a particularly important part in health and healing. And I know this is one of the topics that many people listening to this talk are interested in. I'm not an expert in Spiritist healing at all. So I can't talk specifically about your own particular concerns or interests. However, I think that the general principles of morphic resonance mean that the habits built up in the past by our ancestors and by families, the past generations of our families, have an influence on us in the present through morphic resonance, through habit. And these effects can be very great. I've seen this in practice mostly through the work of systemic family constellation therapy. My wife, Jill Peirce, has been doing this for many years. She's a therapist. She sets up constellations, and I've seen many of these in action. And I must say, I found them extremely impressive. I've also been to ones led by other family constellators like Bert Hellinger and Sophie Hellinger and people in other aspects of family constellation work. And I think what's going on there is that the field of the whole family is a kind of field. Flocks of birds have a kind of field that keeps the flocks the birds moving in the flock as they fly without bumping into each other. They're interconnected through invisible connections. Schools of fish are the same. Packs of wolves have a field connecting the member of the pack, so when some go out hunting to bring back food for the young who are staying in the den, they still remain interconnected through this field. And in fact, I think that these field connections are the basis of what we usually call telepathy, which happens between closely bonded members of social groups, including sometimes animals that become part of our social group, like dogs that become part of our family. I wrote a book called Dogs That Know When Their Owners Are Coming Home, about dogs that pick up their owners' intentions. They know when they're returning. In experiments, we showed this is not just a matter of routine or familiar sounds. It happens even when people come at randomly selected times by unfamiliar vehicles, when no one at home knows when they're coming. The dog picks up their intentions at a distance. The field is a field of interconnection, which shapes the way people relate to each other. Now, in family constellations, it often turns out that a member of a family in the present generation behaves strangely. Sometimes they exclude themselves, sometimes they're suicidal, sometimes they have very dysfunctional behavior. And individual psychotherapy is not very good at explaining it. What I think may be going on, and what family therapists think is going on, is that in a past generation, there may have been a member of the family who was excluded, either because they committed a crime or done something dreadful, or excluded themselves in some way, or committed a murder, or had committed suicide. Someone who's excluded, that person is still part of the family field, and in the present generation, someone may take up that role without knowing why, without even knowing anything about the family history, and exclude themselves or become suicidal. They're being loyal to that person who they're representing in this generation. And in this form of therapy, going back to previous generations, bringing in the excluded person, integrating them with the family field, often has profound healing effects, a rather mysterious kind, on people in the present generation, even people who are not present at the session, remote uncles, aunts, cousins, brothers, estranged parents, others who didn't even know that someone was going to a family constellation therapy, sometimes ring up or say, suddenly I feel different, or what's changed, or they feel the change in the field. So I think that what's happened in the past, what's happened to ancestors, what's happened in the history in the past can definitely influence people now. And within science, it used to be denied that there was even through the sexual propagation, that there could be any influence, because they thought only genes can be inherited, and the genes are all fixed. They can't be changed in accordance with experience. However, now we know that epigenetic inheritance allows for the inheritance of acquired characters. Experiences of previous generations can be passed on epigenetically through the sperm and the eggs, and I think also by morphic resonance. So I think there's two things through which they can be passed on. There's the epigenetic chemical modifications of genes. There's the morphic resonance effect from previous generations. And of course, there's also stories and myths and things that they may hear about previous generations consciously, which influence people. And sometimes healing depends on restoring a healthy link with the past. And I imagine that a lot of Spiritist healing may fall into this category. And by contacting people in previous generations who are now dead, this contact with ancestors or with people who've gone before can have a healing effect because they can continue to influence even though they're dead. And after all, it's mainstream in Christianity, Islam, and Hinduism that blessed people in the past can still help us. That's why Catholics and Orthodox people pray to the saints, and so do Sufis pray to Sufi saints, and Hindus pray to Hindu saints, because although departed, they're still able to influence our lives now. This is a very widespread belief. Hundreds of millions of people, probably billions of people do this, yet it doesn't fit on the current materialist scientific map. So I think science can illuminate spiritual practices, and it can help us understand what's going on. I haven't been able to speak about very many different spiritual practices. As I said, there are 7 in each of my books, and if you're interested, you can read these books, which are now translated into a wide range of languages. Each one gives examples at the end of each chapter of how to try these practices for yourself if you're not already trying them. But I hope that this will help in understanding the bigger question that we all need to understand more about how healing works. Mechanistic medicine believes that we're nothing but physico-chemical machines, therefore physics and chemistry are the only forms of medicine that are considered valid. Physical cures through surgery or possibly physiotherapy, and chemical cures through drugs. Well, these can work. I've benefited from them myself. I've had several forms of surgery that saved my life after accidents and so on. And we've all benefited from them. We certainly benefit from modern dentistry, which is pretty mechanistic. But there are forms of healing which involve more than just physics and chemistry. And within medicine, this is now recognized as the placebo effect. The placebo effect tells us that there are healing powers which go beyond what would be expected from surgery or drugs alone. And what's more, they're very important. These healing powers, the placebo effect, is found in all areas of medicine and is very powerful. In fact, ordinary clinical researchers regard it as a nuisance because it interferes with drug trials, because many drugs work no better than the placebo. We don't understand what placebos are. They're basically things that involve people's emotions, expectations, hopes, and these all have powerful healing effects. So there are many forms of healing that can heal over and above existing medicine. I myself don't think of it as either or. I think what we need is integrative medicine, which includes the best of Western allopathic type medicine, but also includes other kinds of medicine which can be shown to work. If we do medical research where we look at the effects of different treatments and we just ask the question, does it work? Do people get better? Then the answer is there are many therapies which do help people. They do get better. Some people get better some of the time. Even with Western traditional standard mechanistic medicine, it's only some people get better some of the time. If everyone got better all the time, no one would ever die. So no method in medicine is 100% successful in the sense of curing everyone and stopping death. But I think when we have medical research based on comparative effectiveness research, what works, comparing different methods, seeing which work best, then if one of them works better than the others and people say, well, that's only because it's got more placebo effect, you say, well, it doesn't matter. For the people who are better, it doesn't matter what you call it. The question is, are they better or not? I think there's a lot we don't know in healing research, a lot we need to know. And I'm hoping that as science opens up, there'll be a much more investigation of methods of healing that go beyond the merely physical and chemical. We'll understand a lot more about our health and our nature. And I'm quite sure that spiritual practices are going to be found to play ever more important part in this, as we've already finding out how important they are, but there's a lot more still to learn. And I look forward to a day when spirituality, religion, health, healing, and science work together for better human life and well-being, and a better harmony of our life with each other and with the planet on which we live. And I think that day is coming. I think the signs, many of the signs, are actually quite encouraging, partly because we face such terrible crises. Anyway, let me conclude by saying I wish you all the best for your conference, and also for your healing work, which I'm sure is doing good in the world, and which I hope it will continue to do good and to help others. Thank you.
Thank you so very much, Dr. Sheldrake, for this enlightening lecture and your talk about science explaining these healings, the spiritual practices. And as you said, we need so much more research done to really bring this spiritual practice, give them a more solid role in health. So we are really very interested. I think you got us even more interested in learning more about the morphic resonance and morphic fields, that we really hope that in the near future you come back and bring us more about that. In the meantime, we're going to be reading your books. So thank you so very much. And we are looking forward for the more discussion when we do the Q&A sessions. Thank you.
Good, thank you.